Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our panel session today. The panel topic is mastering quality of data and quality and interoperability of data pain points. So I am going to be the moderator for the panel. Just a brief introduction about me. I am Asha Mahesh. I work for Janssen R&D, data sciences. Janssen is pharmaceutical sector of Johnson & Johnson. And one of my primary responsibilities is to actually curate the data, engineering and model the data to make the data consumable for data science. And also at the same time, make a increase the impact of data science within the R&D, whether it is driving precision medicine in the oncology space, or accelerating the clinical trials across all therapeutic areas, and also optimizing the drug discovery process. So those are the areas that we apply data science within Janssen R&D. Today we are going to focus our conversation on reuse of data, not so much about the transactional data, transactional system like EHRs, where the data is very transactional and it's about treatment of the patients at that point in time, or even like in our clinical trials, we generate the data for regulatory approval, we follow the protocol and all those things. But however, when we run ML AI, when we pool the data from multiple sources and also get the data, multimodality of the data together from all these different sources, the quality aspects and dimension of that is very different, right? I mean, we didn't have a say during the data collection. So we don't know what went in there. We don't know how the data was, what standards were used in the data, what metadata was used, and also was there a consistent unit of measurement, and there are a lot of nuances that we have to deal with when we bring this multimodality of the data from many real world, internal and external sources. So that's where I think there is a lot of interoperability and quality challenges that we face. So today we are going to focus our panel discussion on that one, reuse of data, historical data that's collected over like multiple years of time. So, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues today who bring a wealth of experience in this topic. And I will let you introduce. Carolyn, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, Carolyn Pfeiffer. I work with Asha within the Janssen R&D data science. I'm actually the brawn to her brains. I work within the governance area. So I oversee the data governance, the privacy, and the ethics within the Janssen R&D data science area. Jay?
Yeah. Jay Bergeron. I work in Pfizer, in a group called Pfizer Digital. And specifically, I lead a group called R&D Data Solutions Engineering. My team is accountable for the data lakes in clinical and preclinical R&D. And I also served as the scientific coordinator for an IMI program called ETRIX, which was a translational research information collaboration for a number of years, and that might come a bit into the conversation today. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gang Xue. I'm also part of Janssen, and currently I'm leading the data integration and modeling for our CMC process development organization within the large molecule area, and also co-founder of Actual Foundation, which is an industry consortium trying to standardize the analytical data, which is relevant to our topic here. So the main focus of my team truly is trying to democratize the data. And just like Asha mentioned, how do we reuse the data? How do we make the scientists be able to freely access data, self-service, and make those things happen? Looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Nimmagadda. I'm heading up the R&D data office at Sanofi. So my team's responsibilities are how we can bring in the speedy and seamless access to all the data that we are collecting at Sanofi. So mainly focusing on data strategy, why we are collecting data, how we should make the data accessible to the users. That's one of the key area, and also responsible for platforms and data culture as well. And another big piece is data governance and privacy and ethics. How can you make the data reusable? and with the proper access controls and proper policies in place. So it's quite a bit of a challenging journey, but we're all in the same transformation path across the industry and across the companies. So looking forward for the conversation.
Great, thank you. So before we start, I have some canned questions that I'm going to ask the panelists. But however, if the time permits, we will come to the audience as well for the questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask at the time. So I'm going to start with Gang. So why it's important to create an ecosystem to make this high quality data available for reuse and secondary usage, right? Secondary research.
Yeah,
if you can.
certainly. I'm a scientist working in the R&D side, but I think a lot of similar things I can see in the clinical part as well. For one, we have a lot of diligent scientists have been generating data for decades, and those data did not come cheap. And we have thousands of scientists within Janssen with over 4 decades of experience of data locked somewhere. But be able to use the data we're only being able to scratch the surface for now. And how to maximize the value, is a very intuitive challenge, I think, for us. Especially with the environment, as we have seen that we used to be as many of you are probably aware, one drug development cycle, you would take 10 to 12 years in average. We have seen that timeline be significantly compressed before the pandemic, and even more by the pandemic. So there's a lot of, the other effect is actually, we have seen very exciting explosion of innovation in biology. We used to work on, I first actually started at Pfizer, working on small molecule, pharmaceutical, and later scientist curiosity drove me to Amgen, looking to biotherapeutics, monoclonal antibodies. Used to be those are the 2 key modalities that everyone is working on. Now, we actually have over 20 different modalities, ADCs, cell therapy, gene therapy, and microbiomes. So those actually drive, give a lot of opportunity to offer therapeutic, never happened before to patients. Very glad to see even CAR-T can actually cure cancer now, but only certain type of cancer. Great for the patient, but also great pressure to our industry as well, because now we're actually, for Janssen alone, we are actually looking forward to 7 BLA filing in next 2.5 years. Never happened before. So that pressure, and also financially, company, we don't have an open check to hire all the scientists to do. So there's a lot of pressure for that perspective to make this happen as well. On the other side, I feel that the technology development, we have seen mostly in the other industry first, consumer health, how people with from a TikTok get to know you and be able to send you specifically, tailored, clips, etc. Technology is available, it's mature, allow us now to enable the democratization of data, level the ground. Because used to be everyone was thinking, I'm doing this experiment because I have one problem to solve. And I generate that data, and that data is only serving for my purpose and also close proximity of my team. Now change the, just like the big data has driving other industries. Now we're able to now pull everyone's data together, recognizing the pattern, and be able to leveraging the platform, help thinking about the past 12 molecules we worked on. How can we use that to drive a design culture for the next molecule? We can start from a high ground before we start into the trial error in the early phases. I always tell people, think about aerospace industry. When you try to invent an airplane, you don't start by making an airplane. You might try to do so, I would never get on it. You're starting from a computer simulation modeling, and then you make model, go through tunnel test. So that design culture is something that could really help us industry to, one, maximize the value of the data. Second, accelerate our development cycle time and have a more effective, product to our patients. So that's my take on, I think it's right time to do it, and also, there's a lot of urgency we do that.
Yeah, no, well said, Kang. That's true. To your point, data doesn't come cheap. So there's a decades of work that, like you said, the scientists doing the experiments. The wealth of data sitting there and getting that and reusing the data to optimize the next experiment, that's a key. Yeah, thank you for that. So Jay, I'll come to you now. We're shifting the gear a little bit. So what are the benefits of consolidating this cross-industry data sets with respect to any specific disease states for reuse? I know from a cross-industry perspective, what are your perspectives on that?
Sure. In thinking of how to answer this, I'm actually going to start with an internal perspective, company perspective, because I like to describe where we get our ROI from our data lakes. The ROI to date for our data lakes in-house have been predominantly driven by operations. So in our clinical data lake, we have all our ClinOps and all the reporting off the ClinOps data. We have analytics that are associated with our clinical database, or essentially associated with operations, for example. And this has been talked about, and I know we're not the only company to do this. But for our COVID study, we took a deep learning method for determining protocol discrepancies based on change data capture clinical data. And it was absolutely crucial for a 45,000 person study. And that's an example of where we're getting our ROI out of our lakes. Internal operations, the same is true on our preclinical side. So if you take things like our global clinical supply, right, we have a marketplace of data that's been consolidated for that, and where we're getting really good use of analytics is driving efficiencies in terms of how we enable and how we speed our supply and how we make that accurate and make it and make that compliant. Now, so that's right from our organization. There's the value that actually drives the continued investment. With respect to cross-industry, and this becomes a bit more difficult. So again, what are the value statements? You know, precision medicine, disease understanding, doing association studies, you know, baselining molecular profiles for clinical trials. If you have the data together, you can do things. All of those things you all know, right? They are traditional precision medicine type use cases. They're traditional dose or disease modeling type use cases that we've been doing. And one of the things, and they're important, right? And they're important and they're valuable, but they're very difficult because it costs a lot to generate data and it costs a lot to utilize data in a meaningful way. And trying to make that work in these very highly variable data sets, highly variable use cases, and assembling the data in a way that can be effective is a really difficult challenge. And I'll end on, I'll introduce the terms because everyone talks about FAIR, and I'm just getting sick of the acronym over the last 10 years. So I'm going to use another one I'll thank the Harvard Business Review for this, right? It's offensive and defensive data quality and offensive and defensive data use. What we'll probably be mostly talking about in the next 2 days is offensive utilization of data or offensive reuse. Remember, I'm sure you all are aware of this, it is very difficult to get approvals. It's very difficult to reuse data that are human data, depending on the nature of the risk that your organization is willing to accept, regardless if that data is anonymized or not. My organization is very conservative, right? I know other organizations are less, and that's always an impediment. And actually, I will leave you with one last thing, and that's the Grand Killer app. If you're pulling in all these data together, I still struggle with the grand analytics vision. I still haven't seen this. You still, precision medicine tends to be project-oriented, therapeutic area-oriented, very point solutions. I'm waiting for, we pull all the data together, great, we democratize all the data, then how are we going to use it as a company and as an industry in a really effective way? And I still think that's missing. And that's why I'd be really interested in some of the talks over the next 2 days to see if there is something there from a more comprehensive perspective on the use of data. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, even to your point, like internally itself, when we bring this multimodality of data from multiple sources, right, linking the data, that's the interoperability issue, right? You're linking the medical imaging with the clinical outcomes and also linking the real world data that's sitting in the EHRs and then claims with the clinical studies data. That way we can see the progression of the patient, right? And also we can observe the patient over a long period of time. That poses many, many challenges in terms of the quality as well as the interoperability. I mean, it would be nice to see what people are thinking in terms of harmonizing and standardizing and building that consistent, I would say, methodologies to build those analytical ready data sets. So to build upon that, Carolyn, I want to come to you is in terms of, share your thoughts in terms of what are the ethical ways of sharing data for cross-industry collaborations, especially when Jay mentioned the human data, right? The data from electronic health records and personal data. What are the ethical challenges that we have to consider, and also what are some of the global policies that we should be aware of?
So I think everybody in this room is aware that data is data, but if we look at it just that way, then we're not respectful of our company, the way that the data is captured, and ultimately it's somebody, right? And that's one of the things that we always have to keep at the forefront. So I'll look internal and then I'll look external, just as Jay did. Within J&J, we have our credo, we have our business code of conduct, and ultimately, Asha and I work side by side to make sure that our functional areas, our legal, our privacy, et cetera, work side by side with us in that. And across the industry, there's many organizations to help us share data, right? There's Transcelerate, there's Vivily, et cetera. But I think as an industry, we need to turn around and say, hey, we're all tripping over data. It's expensive, as Yang has said. We have a ton of it, but we don't know what to do. Or somebody's doing this and somebody's doing that. When we look at what's going on in EU, when we look at what's going on in the United States with regards to the look of, oh my gosh, there's a lot of data out there and maybe somebody didn't consent the right way because the consent was written in a way that a 6-year-old can't understand it, because ultimately when somebody reads a consent, they're not reading it to understand it, they're just reading it to sign up to something. We need to make sure that it's clear. And that's not just a J&J problem, that's across the industry. And I've worked at a couple of pharmaceutical companies and it's a constant theme. But if we stand back and we think about this, what is it that we want to do with the data? And I think that Jay and Gang and Raja and everybody is all saying the same thing. What is it that we want to do? And it's not just to do with the data, it's ultimately what is at the endpoint that we're looking at. So trust is one of the things that I think that came out very loudly from COVID, right? We gained the trust of the public, but then what did we do with that? And I would push back with regards to the ethical piece of that. How do we ethically move forward as an industry? And how do we use the pieces that we have? Transcelerate is one that always comes to mind because I was involved with it from the very beginning because I'm only 19. And then we look at those and we move forward with that. But as an industry, how do we respect the data, right? And how do we make sure that what we're doing with the data is a respectful piece? And each of us in our own corporations know when your spidey sense is going off, this is right or this is wrong, or this is approved or this is not. And I think Jay spoke to it, the data lakes and the pieces that we use within our own corporations, and then we want to do and move forward. I do want to highlight one thing that within the industry that we're doing that has come to light very, very quickly is across the organizations and across the global landscape, there is a lot of talk about mobile, there's a lot of talk about big tech, there's a lot of talk about whatever. But ultimately, pharmaceutical and pharmaceutical drugs are what we do to help people. It's the patient. And as long as we keep that at the center of what we're doing, we won't lose the scope. But when we're thinking about, oh, we have to move fast, oh, we have to do this, but if we remember that ultimately it's the patient, it's the mom, it's the dad, and I'm not trying to credo you to death, but that's the J&J thing. But I can tell you that Pfizer's very similar, and Sanofi, and Bayer, and BMS, we all center around that. And if we think about the patient and what we're doing, so from an ethical perspective, it's remembering what is it we're doing with this data. Are we going to just put it on LinkedIn? So we have a data and we're just going to throw it out there? No. There's very few people who do that, and it's not within the pharmaceutical industry. So to that point, Asha, your question, ethical things, I don't think anybody in this room is going to run a data set and then turn around and show it to their friends because they're not going to have a clue what you do. Most people here can't even explain it to their parents, let alone their friends, of what they do. So when I think about it, there are rules and regulations that are set up. We respect them. And then from a data governance perspective, when you're working with data, respect the data. Because ultimately it came from your friend or your parent or you. And if you remember that, whether it's anonymized, pseudonymized, or anonymized, whatever, You remember that it actually was somebody. And then if you remember that, you remember to do the right thing.
Well said. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you made a good point, the trust. Trust and data quality goes hand in hand, at least in my perspective. If the data is of high quality, then there's a trust-based data. So with that, Raj, I want to go to you now. What are some of the data quality and interoperability challenges in your organization? And how are you addressing them in terms of like a people, process, technology, however you want to describe that? Yeah.
Thank you, Asha. It's a great segue. I think the patients are gifting us the data by participating in clinical trials, right? How you store this data, how you are going to make use of this data in a most ethical and legal ways so that we can find the best medicines possible. I think that is the biggest challenge. I think we are having wearables, sensors, like decentralized trials. There's so many advancements in science and platforms and technology. So we are creating tons and tons of data, petabytes of data. So how we can store them appropriately is one of the biggest challenges we are facing. Like appropriate metadata based on the type of data you are storing. That's one of the challenges. And the second one is for faster decision making, either you are trying to find a better clinical trial design, or you are finding a patient pool who has more probability of finding in the right for your clinical trial design, or finding a better target, or either you are trying to make a decision at your portfolio level. Should we invest in oncology versus should we invest in other areas? So any of these decisions you can make only based on the data that you are collecting. So if you can have access to this right data sets at the right time with high quality, you'll be able to make the better decisions faster. So that's one of the challenges we are having, is how we can bring in all these data sets in a more harmonized way, connect the data sets coming from different groups so that we can use them in an efficient way. So that's one of the challenge. And then the third challenge is, as all you know, all of you may be experiencing, R&D is a very complex area. The data ecosystem is very complex. So the data standards are different. The industry is evolving on the imaging and some genomics data. So how you set the standards, how you connect all these data sets so that you can create high quality data insights so that we can make the decisions faster. So that's the standardization governance is very, very siloed in individual systems and individual processes. So we are trying to bring in the synergies across all these areas. So I think those are the three main challenges I would say. So how we are handling it is through, first one is process. How we can create standardized taxonomies, standard nomenclature, standard definitions, so that we can find the data that we have and we can able to link the data efficiently. And then the second piece is governance, like how you govern the data so that right people have access to the right data. So you don't try to find the data, like you don't spend like 4 months to find the data, but you will get the data, access to the data at the right time. And then on the technology side, I think maybe many of you may be experiencing too, as we are going through this digital transformation, so there are so many siloed systems. So which one is single source of truth? How you will be automating these systems, connecting these systems in quicker way so that you will have the right real-time access to the data. That is something we are working on. We are prioritizing the critical systems and connecting them and automating them. And then the third piece, the biggest piece, is people. How can you change the mindset of the people to say data culture is critical, right? It's not my own experiment, my own lab, my own function, my system, right? It's organization data, it's organization asset. So how do you make the data more accessible and look beyond your own function so that you'll be able to leverage it more beyond the use cases you have defined. So those are the maybe key 3 areas we are working on the people, process, and technology side. It's a long way, it's a journey. I think we need to continue to plow it through by identifying the right business cases, either it is precision medicine or is it clinical trial design using operational data. So prioritization is a key thing, and then investments into those priorities is absolutely must.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned about the taxonomy, creating taxonomy. Yeah, to your point, there are some taxonomies, there are some dictionaries, ontologies, whatnot, and all those things. But at the same time, when you look at like a different modalities, like genomics, you mentioned, right? In the genomics area, there is no real good standards that are out there. So everybody's creating their own standards. So that's something as some thought I want to leave it to you as well in terms of how do we come together, whether it's an industry or a startup or a healthcare tech, or to build that like consistent taxonomies, the metadata, in order to get those treatments to the patients. Yeah. So Jay, I'll come to you with a question. In terms of the tactical implementation ideas for cross-industry data aggregation, and how do we, I know you already spoke about that, but how do we establish the trust in the quality of the data?
Okay. So I could talk about standards stuff, but I think you all know that. I'll give you some. You probably all know this too. You probably all know this too. But let me give you this and see if it. Right. I'll give you my story, and then you can critique that. That's best. So, looking at precision medicine and precision medicine data, pulling that data together. Some of you may be familiar of this application called Transmart that circa 2010 was released by J&J, some wonderful people at J&J, which was essentially a data warehouse that was put in place to bring together structurally high-dimensional molecular data, particularly gene expression, and low-dimensional, I'll say standard clinical measures, standard clinical data for trials, have that available. We used it in Etrix, we developed it in Etrix, and an interesting thing happens with this. One of the things tactically is in data that is one very highly variable in and of itself. And the uses, I don't want to say use case, uses for the data are very highly variable. What we were essentially finding is that the cost and burden of curating those data and getting them into a warehousing type of model basically sometimes worked, but a lot of cases when someone actually went and said, hey, I got a use for this data, you realize that, well, the way we curated it, which was completely fine, wasn't really amenable to the way that people wanted to use it, especially if you wanted to do that cross-study. Right? It becomes really complicated, and now we were talking about molecular and clinical data, and now throw in real-world data, which I think is a very, very real, very, very big opportunity that probably will help propel, right, some of those grand designs that we referred to. So we switched and proposed a switch in model, right, not to use warehousing, not to do all that curation up front, but essentially get that data into a data lake. So you switch it around in a data lake, you bring it into a raw environment. When people want to use it, that's when you make your investment in curation, right? And you give people access to that data by doing, for us, it was a simple thing. You take an indexer like Elastic, you take something like SciBite, right, that gives you a scientific context, you go in, you index at least all of the terms that are sitting in that data, and then you can have a pretty reasonable overview of the data without doing anything fancy like, trying to fit it into a graph model or something like that. And I know we're all doing that, right? And that's cool. But the idea that there were some simple things that you could do to make that, to expose the data, get it into a place that was maybe somewhat curated, somewhat standard, but when you hit it, someone wanted to hit that data with their own use case, that's when you make the investment. And that kind of worked too, but people weren't terribly excited about that either. And now we're going back to, inspired by, I'll say Roche and Novartis, in case there are any Roche and Novartis people here, inspired by you folks who put lots of money into this stuff and investment. We're going, with precision medicine, we're actually going back and saying, well, maybe we should curate everything again. And I raise that because we're kind of repeating this. And the people who have lived it before, who have been, like myself, who basically say, oh my God, are we sure you want to do this again? Are we sure the value is there if we approach it in this manner? Tend to get told, well, maybe your historical biases might be counterproductive to where the organization is going. But the reality is, I'll leave with this type of environment, I'll leave you with that little story, I'll leave you with that little tactic. That in these cases, at least in my experience, if you try to conform everything together, you are going to be hit with things that you don't expect in terms of uses of that data, and you're going to find all of that investment that you put into it may need to be reinvested to support these very specific types of use cases. Thank you.
That is true. I mean, we are going cyclical, right? Pull all the data, let's see what happens, and then we're building purpose-fit data sets in some cases, which works, but that's what we are doing right now in terms of our data science efforts. We are really tackling high priority clinical and scientific questions and building purpose-fit data sets for those things. So yeah, it depends on the situation. To Jay's point, it's the use case dependent, right? And also another important thing is working with the regulatory agency as to what really works for them. We can't just generate the data and expect FDA to accept that, right? I mean, you have to working very closely with them to get their buy-in into everything we are doing, whether it's across industry or internal. That's also another key factor that we are considering. So, Gang, do you in terms of if you have any thoughts around there any modern ways of accomplishing this accurate and completeness of the data, right? That's important. That's part of the quality and the trust in the data, right? How can we? What are some of the methodologies that we can use to ensure that completeness and accuracy?
Yeah, again, I probably speak more from R&D data, scientific data perspective, but I can see, from what Raj and also Jay shared, there's a lot of commonality to the health side as well. I will say that I will not say old, but some old classic principles, but use some modern implementation. I recall when I first started my career, I can't believe it's 20 years ago, one of the first informatics workshop I went to, the Bob McDowell, some of you may know from UK. He's a thought leader at the time for informatics. He put forward the basic principle is automatically capture the data at origin completely, as complete as possible at least. So there are three key words in his there. Automate, at origin, and then third is complete. And so that concept has been around in 20 years. The key challenge has been how do we achieve that in an economic way? So a couple of key things, a lot of things actually Raj actually mentioned there as well. We have a lot of data, and then there's a lot of human factor, and also we often keep repeating capturing the same data, or metadata I should say, that resides in multiple systems now. Then to the point you lose which is the truth, source of the truth. So the first principle is origin. You capture the data in that origin, because metadata accumulates through its life cycle, right? And then, so always capture as origin. So we know clearly that's the source of truth. The second is automate, as much as possible taking human factor out of the data collection process. We have so many data systems now can auto-capture the data. One, our scientist hates document data because they like to do the design, they like to do the real science in laboratory, but then they have to write up the experiment notebook. It's a pain for them, it's a dread. So it's a win-win if we can take the human out of that way, self-document as much as possible. And the third one is complete. So at the origin, if I create this new metadata, even though I may not need it for my own experiment or my own sake, could be used elsewhere. Again, the reuse of data. So those three principles, you can put that in play, or in much better place. Two challenges actually Raj mentioned of our data. We're not shy of data. We have a petabytes or even amount of data there. But two key challenges preventing us really make use of the data. One is the segregation of the data. So many data systems, like Raj mentioned, that collecting data, they're sitting in different places. Good news is data lake. We almost see every company is building data lake. That mostly can solve that segregation issue. We now can compile all the data together. The second challenge is heterogeneity. Heterogeneity, that's a bigger problem to solve. And I always tell people thinking about the data is all the producers that every farm grow. So all over the country, over the world, there's so many farms produce all types of things. So you can put it into the barn, but as a consumer, as we try to use the data, again, to the point, the key there is not getting the data in good order, is enable what we can do with it to accelerate our drug development. As a consumer, when we try to cook a meal, we don't go to the barn, shopping around, getting everything.
Yeah.
You go to supermarket. You go to some, it's more efficient way. What's the difference there? So you don't just collect the producer in individual barn. You actually sort them. You have your seafood department, meat department, vegetable, fruit, bakery. So this way, based on your recipe, you can easily cherry pick everything as you go. So that's the key thing there. How do we do that curation efficiently? Again, without breaking the bank. Taxonomy, consistent vocabulary, as many people have mentioned there, is the crucial key element of that. There's a lot of debate about Inman model, Kimball model, which is more effective, which is more cost effective. But the key there is, if we can drive from standardization terminology, apply that at origin where you capture the data. So you don't need to deal with the curation issue later on. And that's one of the keys, and that's the reason that I mentioned the Electoral Foundation. It's actually 13 pharma now finally getting together. We're focused not only on analytical instrument data, because we have working with hundreds of different types of instruments, day in, day out. That's just one area. There's even more work there. If we can build industry-wide, high-quality ontology and taxonomy, link them together, we can put into the place where we capture the origin of the data, and then leveraging the system we have to automatically capture that. Then, the data aggregation and harmonization become no issue. However, that even have that in place, only address the future data. We still have legacy of decades data, as mentioned. We are sitting on gold mine. How do we make that happen? Again, if we have this ontology, and then we are more and more using the knowledge graph to driving that, because the organic growth capability of a knowledge graph, and also extensibility of that. You don't need to have a full data set to create a value. This way, based on use cases, you can take chunks of data. The key there is a consistent data model put in place in knowledge graph. You can fill in 20% of the node first, based on use case. But then, molecule by molecule, and then use case by use case, you can keep putting into the consistent. So just like we clean our house, right? It's a nightmare to do the yearly cleaning one time. But we do it a little bit, chip away a little bit by little bit. As long as follow the same game plan, it is doable. I think that's what the journey we have seen here. The building the consistent ontology, consistent data model implemented into data lake. And then every organization putting their data in place. One key thing, we need to leave and agree on consistent breadcrumbs across, allow us to link our data together. Again, using R&D, one example to share that. We have the drug substance manufacturing, making the drug substance. And then we have analytical testing lab, actually doing the quality attribute testing. The product, going to formulation and then going to clinical trial. We have different functions working together. That's the nature of industry. We're on the R&D side, many of you on the clinical side. The data eventually coming together. At Janssen, early this year, we're very excited to launch our first CAR-T therapy, Carvykti. It's a miracle drug. The efficacy is phenomenal. However, the challenge is with the new modality we have in here, how do we control the manufacturing process very effectively? Because used to be we can control everything. We buy high quality raw material and then put into the process robustly. But now, the raw material is individual patient. You take whatever you have, apheresis. So now, how do you make sure that from a very apheresis, which is collected actually outside of Janssen control? And then what's the background allow you to track that into the manufacturer input material, and then lot number. And then lot number linked to sample ID, allow you to collect the, now link analytical data to it. And that lot number also going to clinical trial, have the clinical data. So you need to leave in, make sure that throughout the organization, you agree on the key breadcrumbs consistently used there. This way that everybody can now only contribute to certain part of the knowledge graph data in a good order. But then those breadcrumbs allow you now link them together. You can now do the Spark query any way you want now. So that's, I think, is really my thought on is this collective principle automatically capture data as origin as complete as possible. and then driven by the modern ontology, and then leave the right breadcrumb together. Then our data scientists will be in a utopia world, can do all the miracle things they can do. So that's my take on that.
That's great. Yeah, no, one thing that comes to mind, to your point, having that standard ontologies and taxonomies you mentioned, I've spent significant amount of my time analyzing these data sets as well as also cleaning them, right? It's called glorified those janitorial services, cleaning them during the analysis. Sometimes the quality is afterthought. So for example, I can give you, in the electronic health record system, when we get the lab results, lab test results, the units of measurement is so different from different labs. Sometimes I was measuring like a surface antigen levels, it's like copies per milliliter, or it's an international units per milliliter, who knows what all kind of those things. So those should not be part of the analysis cleaning, cleaning at the analysis time. It should be cleaned even before it gets to that next level. So that's what I've seen in generally. So that's a good point to have that done upfront. Automation, collect the standard terms before it gets to the data lake. Okay, that's good. So Raj, I'll come to you. If you can share any of best practices that you employ to provide that completeness of the data for AI and ML type of activities, and if you have any experience dealing with biased data when you're doing an LMI, if you can share that.
I think data will be never complete, right?
Yeah.
We can never give 100% complete data because it's expensive to get to that level. So we have to see what scientific question you are trying to answer, and based on that, am I collecting the data to answer that question? Is there anything that we can automate in the data collection, as we heard just now? So the amount of time we can reduce on the data collection from the end user's point of view, I think the quality is going to be maintained much more systematically, right? Manual data entry is going to cause more errors. So if you can automate any of that process, I think it will speed up our insights generation. So that origin itself is important. I think you made very great point on how do you automate and how can you put together quality controls in place so that we can create the complete data sets. That strategy is very, very key. Like what scientific problem you're trying to solve, what are data types you want to collect, what quality metrics you want to put in place so that you can say your data is complete. So that is key. We are putting together based on use cases what data types we want to combine. Let's say, for example, you want to do the probability of success or identifying the in the early clinical trial designs. Then we are putting together omics data sets and clinical trial data sets, historical clinical trial data sets together. So that harmonization is very, very critical, but as well, it is complex as well, because if you look at the historical trials, the types of trial designs are different, the standards we followed are different. SDTM is in place in the past few years, but if you go back like 7-8-year-old studies, you won't have similar standards. So a lot of quality issues you will get to when you are trying to combine, and also the metadata issues. So what we are trying to do is, let's see based on our current portfolio, which therapeutic area we want to target. For that therapeutic area, what clinical trials you want to harmonize and combine so that we can reduce the data sets pool so that we can bring in the data sets faster to the analytics platforms. So it's all about prioritization instead of boiling the ocean. And then the next step is platforms. Like how can you create platforms so that you can harmonize in an effective way, in an automated way. Like if maybe in one system you are calling therapeutic area in one way, in another system you are calling therapeutic area in a different way. So you need to do a lot of manual mappings or a lot of time spending in cleansing the data and mapping. So how can you automate that so that if you are cognizant enough and your metadata, if you make your systems metadata driven, so you can make the harmonizations much faster. So we are using that metadata driven approach for data harmonization. And then the last piece is, again, I come back to the culture piece. It is very important. How many of you face you have data-driven insights, but still people don't rely on those insights, still go through their own old way of going through their process, right? So you have to bring the organization along with you. The data is there, data-driven insights are there, but how you can use those data-driven insights in making your decisions faster. How can you create your clinical trial design? Which sites you should target first? If you go to KOLs, they'll go with their gut feel, but how can you use your data to drive those type of decisions? I think that is very, very important in the success of AI and ML.